Okay, so yeah, so the talk for this evening is about this concept of vectorization, which some people will be familiar with from computing, and also this idea of productive codes, which is something I'm going to explain, and its relationship to vectorization. And I'm going to be talking about these concepts in relation to you know, kind of natural systems and how we can apply these concepts to actually understand and think about biological systems and how they might work, including the concept, you know, however kind of imprecise it might be, how they might compute or think of it as computation. But really the computation part isn't the important part. The important part is how can we understand how these systems actually work. And these concepts, I'm going to argue, are very useful concepts to help us understand that. So as always, the art in such, there's not that much in this talk, but what is there is James Robert White's artwork. So so the agenda will be, first I'm going to talk about the notion of vectorization and productive codes. I'm going to explain what I mean by those ideas. Then I'm going to explain the evidence that these concepts are actually relevant in nature. And so I'm going to go through a few papers and talk about how they contribute this, actually, the evidence for this idea of productive codes and vectorization. Then I'm going to look at the concept of this productive code in terms of Claude Shannon's information theory. And then I'll talk briefly about the role of noise in biology and how those two things are related. And then I'm going to begin to wrap up by talking about how vectorization helps us think about how complexity actually develops and how novel functions can develop. And it'll be related to this idea that less is different. You might have heard of the idea that more is different. I'll be arguing that less is different as well. And then finally, I'll talk briefly about some implications for the central nervous system, as in our brains and the nervous systems of animals like us. So obviously a few things to cover there. I'll try not to go too fast. I might skip things if I run out of time, but I hopefully can kind of bring everybody along with the main ideas. So first of all, I'm going to talk about this idea of vectorization and productive codes. So what is a productive code and what is vectorization? So in computer programming or scientific programming, vectorization refers to solutions that involve the application of a set of operations or an operation to a set of values all at the same time. And so it's this kind of used to do parallel computing because you can apply an instruction to multiple values in one step. And so we can think of this very intuitively, a bit like the way I like to slice spring onions. So here are some spring onions. I've got all my spring onions in a row. And when I cut the knife, I simultaneously execute one instruction to all of the spring onions and slice all of them in one go, which is obviously quicker as long as you kind of arranged your onions correctly. So you can think of the different onions as different utilities. Obviously, they're very similar. And you can think of the knife cut as the instruction. We can think of this mathematically in terms of the switch cost between different instructions. Now, to say that the instruction operates over all those utilities at the same time is to say that the instruction I send to utility 1 and the one I send to utility 2, the cost of switching from one instruction to another is actually 0. And that's just a way of saying that I'm doing all those utilities in one instruction. So that's just a way to think about how we've ended up with this very efficient process. However, you can also think of where the cost of switching from one instruction to another is getting close to 0, right? So as that cost of doing one instruction versus another instruction gets smaller, the cost of switching from one to the other, we start to get to that point that we can vectorize those two instructions, that vectorize those two utilities in one instruction. And so this gives us a more general concept that is related to vectorization. And so we can call this, or I'm calling this a productive code, where the switching cost between different instructions is low. We think of the code as a productive code. Vectorization is the limit case of a productive code, which means that as a productive code's switching cost between useful instructions approaches zero, then once it reaches zero, you've got vectorization of those utilities. So they're performed in one instruction because the switching cost between them is now zero. And so that's why we call that the limit case. So now I'm going to relate this concept of productive codes and vectorization to a variety of studies of different kind of codes in mathematics, and show you how this might work. So one thing we can consider is super permutations. So there is actually a nice article about super permutations in Quanta magazine, which is free and is online. So I invite you to have a read of it. So in combinatorial mathematics, a super permutation is where you have n symbols in a string, and the string contains each permutation of those n symbols as a substring. So what this means is that a trivial super permutation, so if n equals 2, a super permutation is 1, 2, 2, 1, because the string 1, 2, 2, 1 contains all the permutations of 1 and 2, and the two permutations are 1, 2, and 2, 1, right? But that's called a trivial super permutation, because there's a more interesting one, which is the string 1, 2, 1, because that also contains both permutations. And we can think of, in my terms, we can think of the second element, the 2, in that shorter string, as a vectorized instruction, because it has utility as both the end of the first permutation and the beginning of the second permutation. So if we imagine that these permutations have utility, then a shorter code implies a higher density of utility. And we can sort of think of it as similar to the notion of information compression. But I'll show that this notion of productive codes is more useful than the notion of information compression for certain things and the things we're talking about. So an example in the article is of where you were trying to figure out how to open a door which has a keypad, and it has one of the, you know it's a permutation of n numbers. If you knew a short super permutation, you could try out all possible combinations in a shorter sequence. And so that's an example of where the permutations have utility. So you can sort of imagine, even this abstract example, that the permutations could have different utilities that you could combine in a shorter string and then vectorize certain parts. So another kind of mathematics that's related to this is called scan statistics. In this sort of maths, this is to do with statistics, we consider the odds of a sequence of events occurring by moving what they call a sliding window over for example, a timeline of events to see what the actual odds of a given sequence of events is actually going to be. And so this is a bit more complicated when you're calculating probabilities, because if you consider what are the odds of getting head, tails, head when you flip a coin, it's important when you're calculating those odds for a sequence that you realize that the possible last head of that sequence is the possible first head of another sequence as well. And so it's a similar idea to a super permutation. You can see this notion of overlap becomes really important. And one result of scan statistics is that when we consider what are the odds of a cluster of events, like it was used in the Second World War, it was used to try and calculate the odds that bombing of London was occurring in a non-random cluster in certain places. if you want to know the probability of a cluster, you have to consider the sliding window statistics, the scan statistics. And what it means is that you'll see clusters are more likely than you would otherwise think because of this scan statistics, because there's more ways that the cluster can happen. And so if we imagine, again, that these events in a sequence have some utility, then the ability for events that have utility together to appear in a cluster increases if we can vectorize those utilities that those sequences have, because it means clusters are going to be more likely. And so this has some relevance to the notion of what are the odds that a cluster of genes will actually occur, right? If the utility that's potentially realized by those gene clusters is amenable to this overlap and this vectorization of utility of the genes, the clusters are more likely. So it's important potentially to understand how these clusters could evolve in genes. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to comparing productive codes to error correcting codes. So in engineering, most of the time we want to avoid what I would call a productive code, because if the cost of switching from one valid code to another valid code is very low, then this implies ambiguity. And ambiguity can often be a source of error and miscommunication. So an example is if you order a prescription from the chemist. If there were two different medicines with similar names, such as Celebrex and Cerebix, there's a risk of miscommunication, right, as a result of them being very similar. So the switching cost between those two names is quite low, especially if you say it rather than read it. And that switching cost being low is actually a risk. So we actually want a lot of the time to increase that switching cost, which is known as the Hamming distance between two codes. And so we develop codes that increase that switching cost. And that way we have reduced the risk of error when we're communicating. An error is due to noise randomly changing in a signal so that you misinterpret the original message and come up with a different message. So in nature, we know that error correcting codes are important because we know that DNA needs to be replicated reliably, for example. So we expect to find error correcting codes, and we do find error correcting codes, or error correction is a processes in nature that we already are aware of with DNA and RNA and so on. Another example of an error correcting code is your credit card number, because if you change one or two of the digits in a credit card number and you get them wrong, you won't end up with another valid credit card number because it's encoded to prevent that mistake from resulting in a valid credit card number from happening. As I said, so in nature, we see this already. And one theory of sexual reproduction is that primarily it exists to prevent errors in transcribing DNA, because you have two copies of everything or more. In some species, you have more than two copies. But this can help to prevent errors in transcribing DNA. So now, how does that relate to productive codes? Because I just said that I think that nature involves codes that try to minimize that switching cost. And now I'm saying error correcting codes try to maximize that switching cost. The difference is we have to consider the notion of utility. So if we consider a credit card, if there was no error correction and a small change in the number, like a mistake when you wrote it down produced a new valid credit card number, it's very unlikely that that would have utility. There's very few situations where you would be happy that that had happened. And that's because the scope of utility for giving a credit card number is very narrow, right? It pretty much has to be the intended number to be useful. But if we think of productive codes, then we have to think of the utility scope being much larger. If the scope of utility is wide, then a productive code is actually possible, because it's possible that a different message received to the one intended could actually be useful. So, I've got a picture of this book here, which I've got on my bookshelf called Failed It. And it's all about how in art, and photography in this case, mistakes can turn into, better things than what was intended. And it's advice for kind of cultivating those mistakes and paying attention to them and making them happen and so on. And in nature, the scope of utility can also be very wide, just like in art. Anything that aids survival is potentially useful. And so even in individual genes, that have a particular utility, the scope is narrower, but it's still much wider than this credit card number. And that's why I think productive codes are likely to be important in nature. It's because of that scope of utility. So if we think of error correcting codes and productive codes, then we think of them as being different, but actually they could be related mathematically, so that similar codes could have utility as an error correcting code or as a productive code. So I'll explain one example. And this is based on finite geometry, and this is a picture of the, I don't know how to pronounce this, but the Fano or Fano plane. This is the basis of Hamming error correcting code. And what happens is that we think of this geometric object as providing us with lines, which are sets of 3 points. So 1, 7, and 6 is a line, and 6, 5, and 4 is a line. And even the circular one in the middle is a line, 7, 5, and 2. And they have a property, which is that no two lines have more than 1 point in common. And so that enables you to come up with a code that stops small amounts of noise from leading to another valid code, a bit like the credit card example. And so you can take a block of 3 numbers, convert them into a block of 7 numbers, which represent the 3 points in a particular line. And you can use that to encode and prevent errors in transmission. And in this case, it's better than a credit card, because even if there's an error, this code has the ability such that you know that must only be one original intended message. So you can correct the actual error rather than simply say it's not valid. And so this is an extremely useful code and was patented and drives a lot of the things that we see in terms of information engineering. Now we can think of this as a productive code potentially as well. If we imagine that the numbers themselves in the code have utility, they encode directly a meaningful message. So rather than standing for a different message and merely encoding that meaningful one in this code, we think of the actual encoded message in the original example as itself having utility and being meaningful. So that would, like a genetic code. So if we think about that, then you have that property that if there is a small amount of noise, it could still have that function of error correction, right? Because there would be certain codes would be recognized and others would not, because we have these meaningful code words. But if there is substantial noise, then you know that the next the different code that would be interpreted because of the amount of noise, you'd end up with a different code to the one sent. That would have a different set of utilities to the one that was originally sent. So if you imagine a mutation, you would know that the mutation is now trying a new set of utilities rather than a similar set of utilities than the one tried before. And so this would be very powerful if you're exploring randomly. You're guaranteeing now that you're trying a substantially different utility. And so to me, that's an interesting kind of productive code. So we go from utility to substantial noise to substantially new utility. And this is important because if you're searching blindly, the ability to have a code that means that you don't look in the same place twice or a similar place twice is a more efficient type of a search, even though it's still random. And so that's an example of a productive code. So now I've kind of explained this concept of vectorization and productive codes. I'm now just going to, in this second part of the talk, look at the scientific literature and see what evidence there is for productive codes already in the literature. And so the name productive code does not exist as far as I'm aware, right? But I'm going to interpret papers that use different terms and explain why I think these are about productive codes. So The first one I'd like to talk about is this paper by Haig and Hurst, which is from 1991, and it's about a quantitative measure of error minimization in the genetic code. So this paper is arguing that the genetic code is optimized to reduce the cost of errors versus a selection of random alternative codes. So they generated a whole load of random alternative genetic codes, and they compared the properties of the average random codes with the properties of the actual canonical genetic code. And they demonstrated that the chances, for example, in the canonical code we have of significant damage caused by the change in a mutation, which is not corrected, is less than you would expect if the code was random. And an example they chose was code changes that can change whether a protein is hydrophilic or hydrophobic. And that would likely be a costly mutation, right? It would very rarely be a good thing to switch a protein from hydrophilic to hydrophobic because of the context in which it's likely to work. And they showed that the canonical code minimizes the chance of this happening, right, in a way that a random code wouldn't. And they argue that the most likely cause of this is that optimization of the code has occurred early on in the history of life on Earth. So what's interesting about this is that on the face of it, error minimization sounds a lot like error correction, right? But it's not necessarily the same. It's quite different, because if you're minimizing the cost of changes to the code, you raise the potential utility of changes to the code. That's not the same as avoiding changes. So that's why this is an example of a productive code. So there's evidence that the canonical genetic code is productive code because it's not evidence of error correction, but evidence that it's optimized to be productive. Okay, so there's another paper, and this one is from 2009, and this is about chorality, specifically Homo chorality. And chorality is a feature of many molecules, biological molecules, which is, well, feature of molecules in general is that many molecules are not the same as their mirror image. So the left hand is not the same as the right hand. They're mirror images of each other, though otherwise can be identical in their structure. So Homo chorality is where you have a whole load of molecules that have the same handedness. So they're all left-handed versus right-handed. So the author kind of does an analysis of how Homo chorality, which we see in nature, so we see homochiral biological molecules, how that could have evolved. And he uses Shannon's concept of equivocation or conditional entropy to explain how prior to Darwinian evolution, very early on in the life, on autocatalytic kind of sets and chemical soup before genetic code evolved, or Darwinian evolution was happening, the evolution of life at that point would have dictated that this Homo chorality would have occurred. And that's why we see it now. And so I think that what his paper is showing us is that this Homo chorality is reducing the difficulty of coordinating with other molecules because of a kind of horizontal kind of interactions between different molecules and kind of life organisms of different kinds. This horizontal transfer of information seems to have created this pressure to coordinate in this way, if you like. So it's a kind of inevitable optimization when you consider these kinds of exchanges of information that are not kind of vertical like inheritance, but also horizontal. And so it's telling us about how the very beginnings of life on the planet could have started, but it's also telling us that frugal kind of coordination in this sense is kind of being amplified by these early events. And so we can think of this as raising the productivity of, you know, the life that now exists and the genetic code itself, in a sense, because of what's been coded for, is more productive because there's less need to coordinate with different mirror images of molecules, right? Because there's this, it's a bit like everyone driving on the left-hand side of the road, right? I'm imagining it that simply, where you don't have to search through so many different options to find a coordination that works. And so this is another example of a productive code. And it's also occurred because of this early optimization. So Homo Chorality is evidence, again, of optimization of the code, of the genetic code in a different way towards a more productive code. So the third paper draws those other two papers together and carries out simulations using differential equations into this kind of proposed early dynamics of life before Darwinian evolution. And it basically argues that this Homo Chorality and this minimization of the cost of errors in the genetic code would have evolved in this pre-Darwinian phase of life, before what they call the last universal common ancestor, before LUCA. And so they argue that in this concept, there's all this, what we now call horizontal gene transfer, those kinds of processes analogous to this early form of life would have been the dominant kind of optimization pressure and would result in this kind of optimization. And so what I want to say about this is that they only talk about code productivity that we can readily see. Like Homo Chorality is quite obvious thing to see. And obviously that paper on code minimization, error minimization we did that work that we could kind of reveal that productivity of the genetic code. But actually there could be much more productivity in the genetic code that we don't know about, right? But it would be explained by this sort of process that has been modeled in this paper. So vectorization would be a limit case of a productive code, as I argued mathematically. Therefore, they could have, these authors may have actually identified a mechanism pre-Last Universal Common Ancestor when optimization could then be exploited in the Darwinian era to produce vectorization of utilities in the genetic code. And this vectorization is just the limit case of productivity, which I've argued we can already see. So here is a paper which seems to show just that. It's about, the authors have titled the paper Multiple Overlapping Genetic Codes Profoundly Reduce the Probability of Beneficial Mutation. And what they mean is that by the current model of evolution, this shouldn't really be possible. You shouldn't really see this overlap. I need to explain, though, that this paper is based on genomics data across different organisms and work by this guy, Trifonov, who is looking not simply at what we think of as the canonical genetic code, which is the code for coding proteins, but looking at other uses of the same kind of code, either in DNA sequences or RNA sequences, to do various kinds of tasks that are part of the process of maintaining DNA or reading DNA or so on. And so Trifonov identified these different kinds of kind of operational codes that don't code for proteins but have specific other uses. And he saw them as overlapping within the code for the proteins. So it's quite an interesting paper because it seems to reveal this vectorization of the genetic code. And that's not how the authors describe it, but that's what it is. So they talk about information compression. They say it's very compressed. And they say, how likely is it that evolution could have produced this incredibly compressed information? But what it is vectorization. So, you know, this is something that you see across all forms of life, in complex life forms, sexual reproduction, and simpler life forms. And what it is utilities, multiple utilities executed by single genetic instructions. And what they argue is that we need a kind of a different kind of evolutionary theory to explain this. And they compare it to the main model of Fisher, which is a traditional kind of model of evolution that's often used. So my argument is that if there was optimization of the code, genetic code, pre-LUCA, then that productive code that we see could be primed for producing this sort of vectorization, which is just the limit case of productivity in this sense. And so it gives us a different way to think about how complex functions actually evolve. So rather than just looking at these operational codes, which Trifonov is looking at and these guys are looking at, we can think about this in terms of utility of protein encoding. So different utilities for proteins. And so then we can sort of generalize from this specific scenario to the way that all the canonical code itself codes for proteins. And just to say that authors are not unaware, or they are unaware of, it seems to me, the concept of vectorization and its relevance to productive codes and the relationship, to this pre-LUCA stuff. Or at least they don't mention it in the paper. They might well be aware of it, but they just didn't put it in the paper. So now I've kind of done this review of the literature. I'm going to take another step back and just say briefly what the productive code looks like in terms of Shannon's information theory. Because obviously Shannon's information theory is really important for understanding code and error correction and all of this stuff. But it also relates to the role of noise in biology, which is another strand beyond genomics. We can talk about, in developmental biology and systems biology, we can talk about how noise might feature. So, okay. So I've been talking for a while, so I'll just have a drink of water. But so if we want to talk about productive codes in relation to information theory, the first thing we have to do is incorporate utility into our measure of information. Because if you remember, the scope of utility is determined how productive a code can actually be. So for simplicity's sake, we can imagine each bit of information that we measure in using Shannon's theory has a fixed utility, in which case you can just take n bits multiplied by utils, which stand for units of utility, and that would give you your n times u util bits. So then we think in terms of util bits rather than bits. So Shannon's theory is mainly about the transmission of information along a channel of communication. And in a noiseless channel, we can consider the information transmitted in terms of the mutual information between sender and receiver. So in a noiseless channel, that mutual information is at its maximum because the received information matches exactly the sent information. Now in a noisy channel, the mutual information is not maximum. And then the cost, of that to transmitting information is the requirement to have to send additional correction information to correct errors created by the noise in the channel. And this was the kind of solution that Shannon developed for transmitting information over long distances, like the transatlantic cable. And he realized that you could digitize that process and then have senders and receivers along the way sending error correcting information or have error correction built in. And that way you could solve this problem of noise in a channel. So we know that noise reduces the capacity of the channel because you need to send more information to correct for the noise. And this is known as Shannon redundancy. But if we now consider util bits rather than bits, then in a productive code, the utility of errors can be non-zero, right? Because the different message than the one you sent might still be useful. And that affects the capacity of the channel in terms of util bits rather than bits. And that's because noise can actually add util bits rather than you losing bits. And so that means you have two possible strategies now. You can either seek to preserve the utility of the existing message, so error correction and so on, or you can seek to increase the utility, and these aren't exclusive, but you can also seek to increase the utility of potential new messages that are actually created by noise. And so a productive code generates information by taking the original signal and if it's pre-optimized to do so, adding noise can actually produce utility. And again, it's like how to turn mistakes and ideas and into ideas that are worth having, right? So So, so we can consider these different models of optimization of the code for productivity and different models of transmission to actually generate productive new utility. And then this leads us on to noise in developmental biology, because there's been a lot of research on whether noise is actually something that is integral to how biology works, and whether it's actually adding functions that we're not really, we weren't really clear about that noise might have in biological systems. And so there's numerous reviews on noise. And it's even been argued, like in this article, that biology is not about genes plus environment. It's also actually about genes plus environment plus the environment plus noise. So that in developmental biology, noise is actually a big part of how you turn out, you know, why one baby is different from another baby. So noise in that process of developmental in an embryo as it's growing, or very early on, basically, the egg is, whichever, you know. So there's all these reviews of noise in decision making by cells, the functional role of noise in circuits, you know, how to measure it, and so on. And there's also a paper that I got to see at a conference a couple of years ago by Eric Deeds from the University of Kansas, where he was looking at the capacity in terms of Shannon's channel capacity of different molecular signaling systems, and trying to apply information theory, which lots of people are trying to do. And what he was finding is that the channel's very unreliable, or they appear to be very unreliable. And so if you're just having a message which is you should switch this on, then that's a binary message. So you want a channel capacity of at least 1 bit, because that means the message is reliably got through. But what he was finding is that the channel capacity for these kind of switches was less than 1 bit, right? So it doesn't seem to be a reliable switch. Now, obviously, now this is us putting on our engineering hat perspective on biological systems, but that's why it's interesting. So what explains, you know, what's going on here? Why is the noise potentially there? Now, Eric Deeds argued that if you looked not at an individual cell with an instruction to do something, but if you looked at the whole population, if there's already noise in the original signal, so we don't know it's a reliable signal that we should trust, then you can kind of average the results with this extra noise in the transmission process, and then you can smooth the response of a whole population of cells. And that was his kind of tentative hypothesis about what the noise could be doing, is that it could be smoothing other noise. But that's a bit of a circular argument, obviously, but it's still a very valid and interesting argument. What he saw is that with other research, we can see that there's lots of molecular so-called switches that don't actually work like switches. They have low channel capacities. And, you know, it's an interesting open question. So what I want to argue is that this concept of productive codes can relate, you know, to this noise research in biology. And we can think in terms of util bits generally. We can think in terms of the utility of different messages than the one that was sent, and how useful is that new message rather than simply responding to the one that was sent. And so we can use that as a conceptual lens to look at these different areas of research to do with making hedge decisions, smoothing aggregate behavior, enabling transitions in evolutionary kind of state space. All these ideas seem to me to be related to this notion of productive codes and util bits. And what I think is we can take it even further and start talking about how you can get productive novelty in developmental processes, because that's where you want to go. You want to say, how can new things actually happen that are actually useful? And so this is related to the use of noise in biological systems. And so we can tie together these two different levels of biological research: the genetic research, where we're arguing now that the code has been pre-optimized so that the errors are potentially more useful than you'd see in a random code, to noise in developmental biology, where we're saying that noise can lead to productive novelty on other utility in developmental processes. So we don't need to think of them as two big separate areas. They're united by this understanding of productive codes. So I guess I've covered that area. So now I'm going to get into the last part of the talk, where I'm going to discuss this notion of how complex novel functions come out of potentially, productive codes and vectorization. So we can take a step back from biology now and think more in terms, I guess, of economics. And what I want to argue is, just like the physicist P.W. Anderson argued more is different. He famously argued that more is different. We can actually argue that less is different as well, because this is where I think novelty can come from in these processes of productive codes. So as an example, I want you to look at this photograph by Henri Cartier-Bresson. And I think it's a great photograph. It's probably not done justice here, but essentially it's, if you notice, it's an action shot, but it has quite a carefully framed kind of still quality to it as well. And so when he took this photograph in the early 20th century, the technology for photography was changing quite quickly. And generally, people were moving to, as the technology changed, it was easier to take photos of fast-moving objects. But previously, it was easier to take photos more of slow, still objects. And we can think about, how did this novel photograph actually happen? And we can think about Cartier-Bresson sometimes taking slowly composed shots, like still shots, with certain equipment, which is good for that. And at other times taking faster shots with equipment that's good for fast action. And it's the same for photographers, up until recently. You'd have to think about, what's your aperture, what's the speed of the film, what's the shutter speed you want, all to do with how fast moving the action is versus the advantage you get from a slower film, smaller aperture, and so on. So we can think of a process by which the technology is gradually changing and making it easier to avoid having to switch your technology from one thing to another for the different kinds of composition. And you can think that Cartier-Bresson starts being able to use the same film for both action shots and landscape shots. So he's using a faster film, and it's not too grainy to take landscape shots, even though it's a fast film. And then we can think that the innovation continues in the industry, and so he's able to use the same lens for different types of shots. He's able to use the same lens without changing the lens. And then we can think, okay, so now when he starts thinking about where I'm going to take some photos today, he can start picking places which offer the chance for both kinds of shot. He doesn't just separate in his head, today I'm doing fast shots, tomorrow I'm doing landscape shots in this particular place that's good with landscapes. And then one day, in mid-composition, he takes both a landscape shot and an action shot in the same photograph. And it's that combination of what was just previously two distinct utilities to now be vectorized, so that in one shot, he's combining the two utilities. That creates a novel photograph. And this photograph is actually hung in the Pompidou Center because it's extremely novel artistic photograph at the time. It was kind of revolutionary, but it was enabled by this technology. That's what I'm arguing. So if you're thinking about how complex novel functions happen, we can think in terms of productive codes, because if we think of the switching cost from one task to another as dropping, these are the conditions slowly emerging for vectorization to finally happen. And the vectorization of different enough utilities leads to a novel, complex function. And so in this table, I've tried to illustrate this by showing in different squares both the type of shot, and the technology and the cost of switching from one type to another. So we go through different shots, and in the final frame, you get the shutter press switch costs is actually 0. And so we in the same shot, without an additional shutter press, we get the landscape and the action shot. And that's where vectorization that was potentially there has actually occurred. So this is what I explained. The last row produces 2 utilities in one shot because there's no shutter press difference between the last 2. So this is the idea. This is the idea of using productive codes and vectorization to express novelty and express how innovation actually happens. It's that combination of the pressure to lower the cost of switching to between different utilities, and that conformance pressure produces a pressure to vectorize, right? So we can think about this because different kinds of conformance pressure could reduce the need to innovate, to vectorize, right? Because, for example, if Cartier-Bresson just said, you know what, I'm going to hire somebody else to do the landscape shots and I'm just going to do the action shots, then in that way, he's reduced that conformance pressure. There's no switching cost because one person specializes in one thing, another person specializes in another, and we never get the vectorization in the bottom row of this table because he looked at the problem in a different way. Or Cartier-Bresson could say, I'll do both shots, but in the morning, I'll do all the action shots, and in the evening, I'll do all the landscape shots. And that way, there's only one switch, right? The switch cost is almost 0 for all the action shots. Then he does one switch, then he does all the landscape shots. Again, that method of solving this conformance pressure leads to no vectorization. So it's very interesting to consider what kinds of specific pressure would lead to vectorization. And I guess this is where you can think of it as a kind of computation because that natural pressure to conform, reducing those switching costs and make a more productive code, there's a type of self-regulation. It's a type of thing that you can control to some extent, right? And then control these results. So to explain how this might look in natural selection, I think you need to consider this idea of orthogonal natural selection. You can think of this vectorization pressure in these terms. And so to imagine what this actually looks like, you can think of the idea that you have a specific set of genes, so a little bit of the genetic code of an organism, and that code being subject to different epochs of selection pressure over a period of time. You can imagine the pressure for selection on the same code moving from one utility to another in each epoch. So if there were 4 different epochs of different selection pressures, there'd be 4 different utilities that this particular code would be under pressure to encode for in normal concept of natural selection. And if you imagine that you had some putative encoding of utility 1 and a different one for utility 2 and a different one for utility 3 and so on, then if that was your kind of best draft of what utility looks like for that code in that epoch, you'd have these different codes that over time, over a long period of time, this code is then switching between them as the selection pressure changes from one utility to another. And so you could have any kind of sequence of those epochs, and you would see this kind of, over time, this switching of these genes. And so you could imagine what's the cost of the code having to recode for a new epoch. That's a kind of a cost that is under pressure to reduce, right? Because the cost of that recoding, the Hamming distance, is the risk of not surviving. Not encoding the new utility quickly enough means that you don't survive. And so that harms the fitness of the organism, that it can't switch quickly enough to the new utility in the new epoch. And we can then simply measure the Hamming distance of the different kind of target codes that we sort of imagine at any one point, and we get the conversion cost. And this is a drag on the fitness of the organism over these different epochs. And then we can imagine that whatever the sort of putative target code might be, that it can change so that the codes then actually, for each utility, become actually more similar. So the Hamming distance between them is dropping. So in this case, we imagine that for utility 1, the last letter that encodes that utility, if that was switched to a G, then that might also benefit, could bring it closer to some of the other codes. And so if the conversion cost over those epochs is dropping, we're creating a more productive code, and we're getting closer to vectorization. Once you get vectorization, so you have here utility 4 and utility 1 now have a G in the last position, then that gets locked in, or is more likely to be locked in, because for those epochs, there's no pressure, there's no conversion cost anymore, right? So this is what I mean by orthogonal evolution, right? Because the main evolutionary process is within each epoch, but across epochs, you get this orthogonal evolution. Now, the problem with this is that it's still very unlikely that it would actually happen, which is what these other authors about the overlapping codes were arguing, that it doesn't make sense. But in the pre-LUCA era, if the code is already optimized to be very productive, the limit case of that is in fact vectorization. So to me, it implies that a productive code is actually is a given, then this vectorization is far more likely. And so this orthogonal process computes vectorization. And what we can think about is how this relates also to other things we know about, like horizontal gene transfer, which is very similar to this orthogonal evolution, where the gene pops up in a new organism with a new epoch, with a new context. And the pressure is created to vectorize as a result of the horizontal gene transfer. Now, I can start to argue how I think sexual selection could also create that same, a different kind, but an also useful kind of conformance pressure to vectorize. But I don't have time to do so, because it's a more involved argument than I can give here, and I've obviously talked a lot already. But there is something that I have there that I could use to explain how I think sexual selection could also create pressure to vectorize. So finally, I'm going to just briefly walk through some implications for the central nervous system, i.e., our brains, how we think and how our brains work. So obviously, because I've talked about Shannon's information theory and util bits, it's quite a general type of approach. And one of the implications, is to quote another physicist, is the noise is the signal, or the noise can be the signal, because that's what a productive code implies. It means rather than a model where we know that we have to correct errors and reduce errors, such as like Bayesian reasoning and so on, where we get feedback to reduce our errors all the time, we can think of the noise as actually potentially adding productive, new novel behavior. And you can see potential examples of this just in natural language, where we think of the redundancy in natural language. We tend to assume so far that it's explained by the need for more redundancy to correct errors and miscommunication. But actually, a lot of the redundancy seems to create errors rather than actually reduce them. So if you think that language is obviously used for thought and planning and so on, a productive encoding of natural language could favor ambiguity, vagueness, polysemy, which is multiple meanings, in order to give you more variations on the original intention. So as long as the scope for utility is wide enough, this may be raising the util bits of thought, right? So this is an important idea, potentially, in terms of how thought and language are related. And if you think about mental health, there's a bias we can think of different levels of bias in terms of the scope of utility, the productivity of your thinking, in terms of how noise can add utility, and you can think of different extremes on that spectrum, right? So this could cast a new light on mental illness and the notion of unreliable inferences. And there's a fundamental difference between a psychopathology model built on the notion of a fragile optimization algorithm, which is correcting errors as learning, where deviations are then catastrophic, from a model where productive noise and mistakes are in fact essential for robustness and adaptive function. So it just gives a very different picture mathematically of what might be going on. And then you have the notion of self-regulated kind of conformance pressure and how novelty can be productive, and how that's a different, as I said, a different model to the current kind of models that we're used to working with. And then finally, if we think about the nervous system in terms of frugal cybernetics and the relationship to vectorization that way, a kind of computer theory approach to the brain has the advantage that if the brain is a bit like a computer, it has that ability to generate an incredible variety of different states, just the way a computer does, right? And that means it's available to solve almost any kind of environmental challenge, right? So that's different to a normal kind of neural network algorithm kind of model, which is more like algorithmic and fixed. But if you have this more heterogeneous model of the brain, how do you deal with the need to modulate that very heterogeneous system? So the brain is full of neurotransmitters, and they're modulated to produce useful results all the time. And then drinking alcohol produces a predictable kind of result in most people, and some people find utility in it, right? So how can that be if you have this incredibly complex heterogeneous system? So the answer, I think, may be that that the cellular subsystems are conforming in a way that even though they do different kinds of tasks and compute different things, they can conform so that a neurotransmitter can have the similar desirable effect across all those different heterogeneous systems. In other words, it's vectorizing across those different states. So an example would be, for example, adrenaline. Adrenaline, if it's acting on a pre-computed kind of conformed sub-processes, for example, you have the fight or flight response, then if those sub-processes want to behave differently in those situations, ideally, so like some sub-processes are more like flight, some processes are more like fight, right? By conforming each other to respond to the instruction in a desirable type of escalation, right? Whether it's running away or fighting, you're controlling this incredibly heterogeneous set of processes. And so it makes sense that this conformance pressure allows you to achieve that control and that vectorization of a very complex system. And so I think that this itself is interesting from a psychopathology point of view. If you're not able to vectorize sufficiently, if it's only fractional, then you start to lose the costs of internal coordination become very high, and you get these disordered states. And the same idea applies in microbiological systems generally, where you have all these different hormones and different things, and you want them to have a desirable, move the whole system into a particular state, but you have these very heterogeneous processes. So again, vectorization by this kind of conformance that I'm talking about would enable that to happen. So that's the end of the talk. In terms of the next talk, as I said, watch this space. I don't know when I'm going to give another talk or what I'm going to talk about, but I think that summarizes really a lot of my thinking at the moment. And thank you for listening. Some of the reference ideas in this talk are listed here. I should emphasize that the original ideas are the idea of productive codes, vectorization is the limit case of productive codes, util bits, and frugal cybernetics. Those are all my ideas. But some of the other ideas involved are Ashby's law of requisite variety, information theory, obviously, utility from economics, and so on. And some people I haven't had time to talk about. And thanks also to these people here on the left for the conversations and the slides and so on. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. And I'll just try and stop the recording.